Fiza Pirani is an Atlanta-based writer and editor. She is the founder of the immigrant-centered mental health storytelling newsletter, Foreign Bodies, which I highly recommend you subscribe to. It is excellent. And we're going to talk about it, in the interview. She was a recipient of the Rosalind Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism and spent 2018 to 19 investigating immigrant and refugee mental health stigma and barriers to care in Metro Atlanta and beyond. She currently lives in Atlanta. So in Atlanta, welcome, Fiza. Thank you so much for talking to me. I want to know, what was your early career trajectory? How did you make the move, earlier in life to the sorts of things that you're interested in now?
So I graduated not too long ago in 2014, and I actually started college off pre-med, like many people I know, many South Asian people I know. I'm the child of 2 doctors too, so I always just felt like, okay, feels like I'm supposed to be doing that, and there's quiet pushing. Not really outright go become a doctor, but a little bit of a nudge. And so I began college, did half of college pre-med, hated it so much. Writing has always been in my blood. Lo and behold, after college, it took me actually a year before I decided I'm going to start the journalism route. I was working in a law firm of all places, kind of just like, okay, if I can't become a doctor, maybe my parents will be okay with me becoming a lawyer. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I hated it. It was not my thing. But I was slated to go to law school, and then I got an interview at my local newspaper. And the first day that I walked into that newsroom, I just knew that's kind of where I belonged. I was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for about 4.5 years. And just last year, I decided to go in a different direction. I felt like I needed my audience to be people like me. And I just felt like I needed to kind of have a departure and figure out my own thing. Also dealing with a lot of burnout that comes with newsrooms, inevitable. So yeah, now I'm kind of doing my own thing and working a little bit harder on Foreign Bodies and growing that and writing about all the many, many issues that are affecting me and working on my first book too.
Before I talk about, I ask you about, the mental health beat, I do want to take a step back and talk a little bit about your own identity as an Indian American who is Ismaili. And I'm coming from Pakistan, in a country where Ismailis are an extremely beleaguered minority, and I moved to the US when I was 22. But I do know, and I've known that the American diaspora treats people and minorities in different and perhaps sometimes equally bad, but different ways. And I'm just wondering, what was it like? What is it like navigating Ismaili identity in the US and in the South Asian community in the US?
The Ismaili identity is so confusing. So I was born in India, and I only spent maybe a month there before we moved to Saudi Arabia, actually. And there is no Ismaili community. It's hush hush. I mean, when we used to pray as a family there, like no one could know. Your blinds had to be shut. You had to pray in whispers. There was you could get in a lot of trouble. And we left a little bit earlier because the religious discrimination was really on my parents, especially. My dad is very, very religious. Just grew up, very embedded in the Ismaili community in Indore, India. I have always had that kind of in me. Like I knew that marginalization is going to follow me in various ways. And, when we came to America, I definitely felt that there was a sense of freedom in a way. And I mean, that's a lot because people don't people who aren't of the Muslim diaspora, or the Indian or Pakistani Pakistani diaspora, they can't really identify me as an Ismaili. Like, no, first of all, hardly anyone I know knows what an Ismaili is.
Yeah.
So to not be able to even identify that in a way kind of, reduces the level of discrimination you feel. I might not even seem Muslim to a lot of people. Even within the Ismaili communities wherever I lived, I always felt like a bit of a minority, just because my parents sent us to white suburban schools, whereas most of the people that I went to Jamaat Khana, our mosque, whenever I went to Jamaat Khana, most of the people there lived right by Jamaat Khana, and they went to schools right by Jamaat Khana. And I always felt like the oddball, like no matter where I went, whether it was at my white high school or at, Jamaat Khana religious education classes, like I was always the white brown girl.
Mental health and mental illness is a very brave beat for a South Asian American to take on, no? Like, we're not the only minority community that stigmatizes mental illness, but it's definitely a radical move for a South Asian journalist, I feel. How's that for you? Did you find that navigating personally a difficult thing?
Yeah, I definitely found it difficult to navigate mental illness on a personal level. And then also while I was, working to report with the Carter Center initially. And I would say, like, personally, I don't remember the word mental illness or mental health really coming up in my vocabulary until I was like late in college or like right after college. Like, that wasn't really a subject that anyone spoke about. Personally, like, obviously I knew that it wasn't really a subject that my own family, and we're very close, we don't even talk about until, like, I forced them to later, but we had never really talked about mental illness like growing up. And so once I started reporting through that Carter Center fellowship, and I spoke to like hundreds of immigrants across the diaspora, not just Indian, but like immigrants of, from everywhere, specifically in Metro Atlanta. And I noticed like the same thread, like everyone's just like taboo, taboo, taboo. They wanted to talk. A lot of them wanted to talk, but they didn't want their names attached. They didn't want pictures. They didn't want, all the things that do make a story, it's sad to say, but a story worth publishing, a story worth reading. Like, all those facets are really, really important in publishing a news story. And so, I mean, it became very, very clear to me that this was going to be really challenging. And I mean, fast forward, I didn't even publish those stories in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution because I wasn't confident in them. I wasn't really like, I didn't feel like they were where they needed to be. I felt like there needed to be a lot more work within the community to encourage them to come forward and tell their own stories instead of me kind of forcing it on them. And so that's kind of like how that, Foreign Bodies was created. It was like, it needed to be its separate thing, kind of disconnected from like the mainstream media as it is.
I really want to talk about something that I find really interesting about your work, which is how you pull in other beats, and other areas of journalistic exploration. I'd love to talk, for instance, about how climate change is changing in the past, which I really see as both a very grassroots story that you wrote, but also one that engages with, really big philosophical and historical questions for the landscapes your sources were talking about. What was it like reporting out that story in particular?
Almost dismissing to only talk about immigrants in the form of like naturalization or citizenship and, just like the stigma in general associated with mental illness. There's so many, we're as complex as like every other individual. And so climate change, if it's such a big deal for so many people, it's definitely a big deal for immigrants too. And I think there's a very unique perspective that immigrants can bring with all those fragmented identities. That kind of sparked like, my kind of interest in writing about like the disconnection that we feel with changing landscapes, and our memory of what used to be and what is now. And and I mean, that's kind of what led into talking about climate change.
I'd love to know, like, what actually reporting that story was like? What was the
Yeah,
process?
it was very emotional. I will say reporting that story was very, very emotional. I I'm gonna just mention like my own connection with depression. A lot of it has to do with not belonging to any place within any border, and that really, that led to a lot of actual suicidal ideation for me, and suicidal thoughts, like especially like with the anti-immigrant rhetoric post 2016 and everything. It was really weighing heavy on me, and um, the only thing that really got me out of the worst of my mental illness experience was to view the world as like borderless, kind of like I had to kind of like feel like, okay, like this is my world. Like I had to erase the borders in my head like,
Yeah.
to feel kind of like I wanted to still be here. And so climate change became a huge part of that. Like I kept worrying about the planet because it's my planet. Like it felt like a whole other perspective that I didn't know I had. If you think about like all the cultures that are kind of wiped out with environmental pollution, with climate policies that completely disregard the existence of a culture or a tribe. If you take the Amazon rainforest, for example, in Brazil, so many tribes and so many groups of people kind of, swept under the rug for political and financial gain. And, you're kind of completely disregarding people. And if you think about like the next decade or a few decades, the last person from that community will pass away. And it's hard to know like if how many people will still remember them. And to me that like really, I don't know, it feels really heavy and emotional, but it's also really empowering to talk about because it doesn't get discussed. And a lot of climate policy does not incorporate culture preservation. And it's been really like reporting that story after talking to Victoria Herman of the Arctic Institute and learning about all the different ways that climate scientists are trying to work to preserve culture. I didn't know any of that. And so to me, it was defeating, but also very empowering to report on that.
Yeah. I mean, my personal introduction to your work was actually, an excellent article about the link between environmental pollution and mental illness, particularly depression and bipolar disorder, but in teenagers. And this was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It was a short piece, but I think what you're alluding to is that environmentalism and the discourse around climate change does not, bring in the many other facets that are, swirling around us. Environmental justice, radical environmental justice, as, radical, often socialists talk about it, it really puts all of these things together as a form of justice. So the connections you're making in your work between climate change and mental illness are a sort of very important component of that. Is that a correct assessment, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of that that comes down to, identity and how like monumental identity is to one's like comfort. And identity is related to environment, it's related to mental illness, and to see like one crumble is going to affect the other.
I found your suicide contagion article at the right time. It was interesting because I was wondering, when I read your article on suicide contagion, I was thinking about how um, it was that so many upper middle class or upper class kids of my age that I knew and grew up with in Lahore have been experiencing, well, a suicide contagion. It's really a fascinating and incredibly sad thing to me, and I still don't really know how to make heads or tails of it, because every year I hear about something new and I just fail to comprehend how this has occurred. What do you feel about the factors that play into what you call suicide contagion. What are they? Like, what are we talking about in particular?
Yes, suicide contagion is so complicated, and a lot of that is because the research is fairly new, actually. Like, there's been a lot of like, you know, very old research, like from the beginning of like when suicide used to be initially discussed in mainstream media, but there hasn't been a significant amount of research, and it's ever changing research, as you mentioned. Like, it's hard to like really grasp, like, okay, like how big of a deal is this? Um, you know, I was so shocked to learn that suicide contagion has been, or suicidal thoughts have been like kind of on the rise in a lot of the American wealthy neighborhoods as well. And teenagers in wealthy suburban neighborhoods, especially. I
Yeah.
mean, that was when I tell people that, they're like, what? You know, they're so confused. And like, I did a really like a long form story for the Atlanta Journal Constitution after a Georgia teenager died of suicide. And I spoke to her father for about like 6 to 8 months, kind of like following his grief. Like, that was the main thing I wanted to do, is like tell her story and the family story way after the event itself. Like, have always been frustrated with the way that media portrayed suicide, and I wanted to take it very, very slowly. And so, you know, the whole time I remember him kind of I remember him kind of reiterating, you know, we gave her everything, like she had everything, like we were a close family. And so it's interesting, like when you see people who have it all together on paper or, you know, online, to see that they're like troubled inside. I don't know that you can't make a connection between, like a direct connection between, you know, if you're wealthy, like you're more likely to be X, Y, and Z or anything, but it makes you think about how financial prosperity is not like not necessarily, you know, going to protect you from mental illness. Like, that's not like, it's not like the more powerful you get in any way that you're going to have some kind of layer of protection. But when it comes down to like the factors that kind of influence suicide contagion, I mean, there's a lot. If you haven't noticed, like it's only in the last like 10 years that newspapers are really, you know, like publishing stories about suicide. Like, at least I know at the AJC, like we still don't report like if there's just a suicide death. Like, that's not, you know, something that we do. Even when there is like a celebrity suicide, it's complicated how much coverage that we'll give it. And I think a lot of times just reporting that someone died of suicide, like, I think it's, you know, it's news if it's a celebrity or a prominent person, but they have to follow up with something. Like, you have to include resources, you have to include some kind of like sense of hope. And I don't think that's a thing that most newspapers or like news outlets do at all.
Okay, so let's dive right into foreign bodies. What was, I think you've alluded to this, but you know, what was the impetus for this, and why and when did you start this really marvelous newsletter that I have plenty to say about, and I will after you answer this question?
So in 2018, that's when I was really lucky to be awarded a fellowship with the Rosalind Carter Mental Health Program with the Carter Center. And so that kind of, you know, gave me some kind of financial support and mentorship to start looking into immigrant mental health, which by 2018, I was deep in, you know, my own depression. I was definitely interested in whatever was happening within people who look like me, people who came from places like me. Like, I was just personally curious. And so with just the state of America and the building anti-immigrant rhetoric, it felt like just something that I needed to somehow discuss and look into. And so, you know, newsletters, I have always loved newsletters. I just feel like they're very intimate. they're very unique in, well, I guess they're not unique anymore because everyone has a newsletter, and I love that. I love that, but
Right.
not as unique.
I mean, it depends on how many you subscribe to, right? Like
Yeah.
I literally only subscribe to two newsletters.
Oh, really?
One is yours and the other one is Study Hall, which is,
Oh, I do love study
yeah,
hall.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, so I just felt like a newsletter was like the right fit for the kind of stuff that I'm looking for. And with email is a very comfortable tool for a lot of people, especially like South Asian immigrants, like older immigrants. Like my parents are regularly checking their email. Like email is just like very easy access, and I don't know, it just felt like the right medium. I just reached out to someone who had tweeted about their depression. I was like, hey, like I'm doing this little thing. Like, do you want to just talk about like your own experience? And it was much shorter than the issues are now, but I basically thought of like writing like a little essay on her at the beginning, and then going into like, okay, like what does the research kind of say about like the experiences that she's having? And then what are some resources that can kind of back, the experiences that she's having? Like, so that in the end, like after you finish that issue of a newsletter, you don't really leave with the, oh my God, this is so sad. You leave with the, okay, like, okay, let me try this. There's like some kind of like activity or like some kind of hope at the end of it, with some, not a solution, but something that could kind of move you towards being healthier.
I have feelings about foreign bodies. One is that I think of course, the thing I love most is that you're driving personal narratives from people who've experienced mental illness or various forms of difficulties in mental health in their lives. But there's a marriage of the personal essay and the journalistic eye, I find, just in the way you construct the newsletter, which I find very interesting. And it's a very nuanced balance. And you find space for solidarity with, undocumented immigrants and Black Lives Matter. And there's a sort of conversation broadening aspect to the way the newsletter is presented that I personally, the emotion I feel when I read Foreign Bodies, and I think this is why I stuck with it, because I as somebody who struggles with anxiety, I would have thought that such a newsletter would make me very anxious, but it's actually very soothingly informative.
That's really good.
Because I would not think such a newsletter. I would think such a newsletter would be very sad and anxious for me. But actually, I feel very comforted and not alone when I read it. And also, as you said, I think it's actionable.
Yeah.
So I do want to ask, like, and this is like, I guess, a technical question. It is about the process of putting things together, about like making like this collage or patchwork that is the newsletter. How do you create that balance in terms of there's personal narrative, but it's reaching out to all readers in a sort of universal manner,
Yeah.
because I mean, obviously you have been embedded in the immigrant community at large, not just the South Asian immigrant community, right? So you have that universalizing tendency. And so how do you do that?
One of the reasons I chose to call it Foreign Bodies and not, the immigrant newsletter or something like that, is because my experiences of feeling like the other are very universal. And, it could be like you moving from a big city to, white suburban community, or if you're a Black woman working in like the tech field that is heavily dominated by white men. It's not necessarily that you're an immigrant or she's an immigrant or he's an immigrant or they're an immigrant. It's like, it's really just about feeling other, which Foreign Bodies, you're just where you aren't expected to be. There's no way that we can fight for immigrant rights if we're not fighting for everyone who is marginalized. And so like, you can't have a conversation around something like this without including everyone who has felt in some way or another like that.
I want to point out that I do think that, I've seen, I can't exactly remember, where and when it was, but it's, I also think that you deal with class in the white community as well, right? Like you have dealt with poverty, and I believe it was something about homelessness and poverty that I read in foreign bodies, and I think I'm just very intrigued by the the class-based solidarity aspect of it, because there is one, and I think that there's an aspect of we're fairly familiar with this narrative, right? That there's like this divide and conquer strategy between the white working class and the immigrant and working class and the people of color who form the working class. Um, but those classes are all underclasses, in a sense. So I just really, really like that, overall broad schematic that you have. And I think is that something that you were very conscious of when you were going into it?
No, I
What?
think like my like, the thing that I'm most conscious about when it comes to foreign bodies is inclusivity, and that I feel like automatically lends into, discussion about like inclusivity across classes. And yeah, I don't think I actively think about that. I think it's something that naturally happens if you are invested in,
That's your ideology.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just like, I don't know. Yeah, it's not something that comes to mind, but it's, I don't know how often I like analyze my work either.
Yeah.
So
I don't know how often many of us analyze.
yeah.
Like, I
Let
think
me
it's an interesting question because I feel, yeah, it's hard to analyze your own work.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that outlook. Now I feel like I'm going to be a little bit more conscious about that too.
Well, I mean, I think that it's just, I don't think you needed to hear it. I am just deeply grateful for foreign bodies because I mean, it's helped me, and I think I told you this very early on, like because we had talked about it, and you had told me about foreign bodies, and I signed up for like the free trial and everything,
Yeah.
and immediately I was just like, what is it about this newsletter that I'm like? Usually, I delete newsletters. I'm not good with them. I can't take that barrage, you know.
Yeah.
But both foreign bodies in particular, I was very much just like, wait. This is something that I think that like I need, as like a morning routine.
Yeah,
You know
that
what I
means a lot,
mean?
really. That means
Yeah.
a lot of blood, sweat, and tears go into that.
Well, I mean, it's paying off, and I'm just yeah, I encourage all of our viewers to subscribe, and I want to thank you so much